Janette and Jane were simply enjoying a day in their small town when an encounter with a suspicious officer changed everything. What started as a casual stop for candy quickly became a test of courage and strength, revealing a powerful secret that could alter the very way they were seen. Some moments go beyond ordinary. This is one of them. Welcome to our channel, where every story is crafted to inspire, uplift, and spark new perspectives. If you enjoy tales that blend heartwarming moments with unforgettable life lessons, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe. Janett and Jane's Tale. Janette and Jane, African-American twin sisters aged 14, walked together, laughing and talking as they strolled home from school. Despite their different hairstyles, Janette's wild curls bouncing with each step, and Jane's braids carefully tied back, they moved in perfect sync, a seamless duo. The twins were not only sisters but best friends, known for their kind hearts and sharp minds. As they approached Mr. Gorman's candy shop, their eyes sparkled with excitement. "Come on, let's get those lemon drops," Janette said, pulling Jane inside. They dug into their pockets, pooled their change, and bought a small bag of candy, carefully splitting it between them with laughter and the occasional playful nudge. Just as they stepped out, they accidentally bumped into a woman in a crisp, tailored suit. She was well-dressed and clearly not in the best of moods, her expression one of irritation. She glanced down at the twins with a sharp look, her gaze full of disdain. "Watch where you're going," she muttered under her breath, her glare lingering on them a moment too long before she huffed and walked away. Janette and Jane exchanged a quick glance, discomfort crossing their faces. They felt the unspoken accusation, the weight of her gaze assuming they were up to no good. The tension didn't end there. Standing nearby, arms folded across his chest, was Officer Mitchell, a middle-aged cop who was well known in town. He was tall, with a thick mustache and piercing eyes that missed little. The twins noticed his gaze following them, and a flicker of unease passed between them. They had seen Officer Mitchell before, patrolling the neighborhood, but this time he seemed more interested in them than usual. Without warning, Officer Mitchell stepped forward, his expression hard and serious. "Girls, I'm going to need to check your bags," he said, his voice stern. Janette, caught off guard, stammered, But we didn't do anything. We just bought some candy." Officer Mitchell's eyes narrowed, glancing briefly at the candy bag in their hands before locking back onto them. "Stealing candy from Mr. Gorman's shop. Hand it over." Jane's eyes widened in shock. "We didn't steal anything. We paid for this." But Officer Mitchell wasn't listening. His mind seemed set, his suspicion turning quickly into accusation. "I don't have time for excuses. You're coming with me to the station. We'll see if the story changes there." Janette felt a knot of fear form in her stomach. She looked up at the officer, trying to summon the courage to stand up for herself and her sister. "Sir, you're making a mistake," she said, her voice steady but trembling slightly. "We're not troublemakers." Officer Mitchell sneered, his tone dripping with disdain. "Is that so? You girls look like the kind who know how to make trouble." A wave of frustration surged through Janette, mingling with her fear. How could this be happening? She felt her sister's hand grip hers, a silent source of comfort as they exchanged a look filled with worry and unspoken strength. "Officer, please." Jane's voice was quieter, gentler, hoping to appeal to any sense of fairness he might have. But her words fell on deaf ears. He ignored her, signaling them toward his car. The twins felt a mix of helplessness and humiliation. They knew they were innocent, that they had done nothing wrong, but they could feel the weight of his assumptions pressing down on them, trapping them in a situation they couldn't control. As they reluctantly climbed into the back of Officer Mitchell's patrol car, the atmosphere inside felt thick and suffocating. The seatbelt felt cold and foreign, as if it was binding them in place, and the silence in the car was as heavy as the tension that filled the air. They were trapped, powerless against a system that seemed to have already decided they were guilty. Janette cast a quick look at her sister, her eyes filled with determination and a quiet resolve. She wasn't sure what was going to happen, but one thing was clear: they would face this together, come what may. And as they sat side by side, hands tightly clasped, an unspoken feeling grew between them. A strength they didn't fully understand yet, but that felt as real as the fear knotting in their stomachs. In the eerie quiet, Janette looked over at Jane, her heart racing. They didn't need to say anything. A look was enough to convey the swirling fear, anger, and helplessness they both felt. But amid those emotions, there was something else, a spark of determination. They both remembered their grandmother's words, often spoken in soft whispers during times of trouble. Keep your heart steady, girls, and remember, there's strength inside you stronger than any fear. Jane swallowed, her eyes meeting Janette's as they silently reminded each other of their grandmother's wisdom. Slowly, they took each other's hands, gripping tightly as if grounding themselves against the overwhelming feeling of injustice. Then suddenly, the radio in the front of the car crackled to life, interrupting the heavy silence with a burst of static. Officer Mitchell frowned, reaching to adjust the dial. But the static grew louder, turning into an unsettling, high-pitched whine. He fiddled with the controls, muttering under his breath, "What in the world?" But before he could get a clear signal, the police lights on top of the car began to flash erratically, casting eerie red and blue reflections around the interior. "What's going on?" Janette whispered, her voice barely audible. Jane squeezed her hand, just as confused, but something inside them both was shifting. The fear they'd felt just moments before was slowly giving way to a strange calm, as if a wave of warmth and courage was washing over them. They couldn't explain it, but the tightness in their chests began to loosen, replaced by a growing sense of power. Officer Mitchell, still grappling with the sudden technical issues, glanced suspiciously in the rearview mirror at the girls. But he quickly turned his attention back to the dashboard, tapping buttons and muttering about faulty wiring. Janette felt the energy intensify, a kind of invisible pulse that seemed to thrum between her and Jane. As they held hands, it felt as though they were somehow becoming stronger together. A strange tingling spread from their joined hands to their entire bodies, making their skin prickle. They looked at each other, eyes wide with a mix of shock and awe. Neither of them spoke, but in that shared look, they both understood. They were somehow causing this. Before they could process the feeling, the car began to slow down, its forward momentum stuttering and then dragging as though it were being held back by an invisible force. Officer Mitchell slammed on the gas pedal, but the engine seemed to resist, chugging along at an agonizingly slow pace. His frustration turned to panic, and he slammed his hands against the steering wheel. "What's happening to this car?" he shouted, gripping the wheel tightly as he tried to control it. But the car continued to lose speed, coming to a creeping halt in the middle of the deserted road. No matter how many times he turned the key or pushed the accelerator, the car refused to respond. In the back seat, Janette and Jane were as stunned as Officer Mitchell, but a hint of realization was dawning on them. They looked at each other, and a spark of fear mingled with awe in their eyes. Could they really be the ones causing this? It didn't make sense, yet the feeling of power between them was undeniable. Officer Mitchell, now breathing heavily in frustration, tried once again to turn the ignition. But the engine refused to budge, and the flickering police lights continued casting unsettling shadows throughout the car. He turned around, his face red with anger and confusion, as he glared at the twins. "What did you two do?" he demanded. The twins exchanged a nervous glance, unable to explain what they themselves didn't understand. But Janette managed to summon the courage to speak up. "We didn't do anything, sir. At least, not on purpose." Officer Mitchell huffed, still grappling with his inability to control the car. His gaze flicked between them and the malfunctioning dashboard, suspicion written all over his face, but he couldn't make sense of the situation. Jane whispered, almost as if testing the strange energy, Do you feel that, Janette? Janette nodded slowly, not quite sure what to make of it, but feeling braver with each passing second. As they sat in the unmoving car, their hands still clasped, they realized that whatever had just happened, it had come from within them. There was a strength, a force they'd never felt before, and although they didn't yet know how to control it, they knew it was there. In that moment, their fear transformed into a strange, quiet confidence. It was as if, even in the face of injustice, they had discovered a hidden reserve of power, a power they didn't fully understand, but that somehow they sensed would help them stand up for themselves in a world that seemed too quick to judge them. He groaned, reaching for the radio to call for backup. But when he pressed the button, the radio emitted only static, crackling loudly before fading into silence. Officer Mitchell's frustration boiled over as he turned to face Janette and Jane in the back seat, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What did you two do to my car?" he demanded, his tone sharp. Janette, still holding her sister's hand, looked up, her eyes wide with both surprise and a spark of newfound strength. "We didn't do anything," she said firmly, her voice steady. "We're just as surprised as you are." "Don't lie to me," he snapped, his gaze shifting from one twin to the other, searching for signs of guilt. "I don't know how you're doing this, but I know troublemakers when I see them. You two must have tampered with something." Jane, usually the quieter of the two, felt a surge of indignation rise within her. She had always tried to avoid confrontation, but something about this moment, about the power she and Janette had felt, gave her the courage to speak up. "We didn't touch anything, officer," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Why do you think we'd even know how?" Her words seemed to unsettle him. Officer Mitchell's face reddened, and he leaned forward slightly, using his stature to try to intimidate them. But before he could say another word, something remarkable happened. The entire car began to glow faintly, a soft, bluish light emanating from the dashboard, spreading outward until it enveloped the seats, the doors, and even Officer Mitchell himself. He froze, his eyes widening in shock as he tried to move, but his limbs felt like they were weighed down by an invisible force. His hands hovered in the air, his mouth open as if to speak, but no sound escaped. Panic flickered in his eyes as he realized he was completely immobilized. In the back seat, Janette and Jane exchanged a stunned look, both amazed and a little afraid. They hadn't meant to do this, but somehow their newfound power had taken control, holding Officer Mitchell still. They could see the fear and confusion in his eyes, and it was clear that for the first time, he felt completely powerless. Seizing this unexpected moment, Janette took a deep breath. Her voice was soft, but carried an unmistakable strength. "Officer Mitchell," she began, "we didn't do anything wrong. All we did was buy some candy after school. We're just kids." Jane nodded, her gaze steady as she added, "You assumed we did something bad just because we're us. You didn't even give us a chance." The officer's eyes darted back and forth, the only movement he could manage, and a faint hint of regret began to seep into his expression. Janette continued, her voice trembling slightly but growing stronger with each word. "Do you know how it feels to be treated like you're guilty just because of how you look? It's scary, and it hurts." In the silence that followed, Officer Mitchell's face softened. The initial anger and suspicion in his eyes were replaced by something else, a hint of shame. He was forced, in that moment, to confront his own actions, to see himself through the eyes of these two young girls who had done nothing to deserve his suspicion. He began to understand the impact of his assumptions, how his quick judgment had turned an ordinary day into a nightmare for two innocent kids. The realization weighed on him, his chest tightening with the uncomfortable awareness that he had been wrong. He saw his reflection in the rearview mirror, and for the first time, he didn't like what he saw. Still immobilized by the strange force, Officer Mitchell listened as Janette continued, her words sinking into him with a quiet power. "People like you think you know us just by looking at us, but you don't. We're not troublemakers. We're just people who want to live without feeling like we're always being watched, like we're always one mistake away from being punished. Slowly, the glow surrounding the car began to fade. Officer Mitchell regained control of his limbs, feeling as though a tremendous weight had been lifted. He glanced back at Janette and Jane, his gaze no longer filled with suspicion, but with a kind of respect, tinged with regret. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, almost hesitant. "I'm sorry," he said, his words faltering. "I was wrong. I shouldn't have assumed things about you. I see now that wasn't fair." The twins exchanged a look, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. They had never expected an apology, especially from someone like Officer Mitchell, but they could see the sincerity in his eyes, the honesty in his admission. As they sat together in the stillness of the stalled car, Janette and Jane felt a sense of triumph, not in having power over someone else, but in having finally been heard. Slowly, Officer Mitchell flexed his fingers, surprised to find he could move again. He looked up into the rearview mirror, meeting the gazes of Janette and Jane, and for the first time, his eyes held no suspicion, only a quiet understanding. Clearing his throat, he turned around to face the twins directly. His voice, usually so commanding, was now low and humble. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling foreign but necessary. "I shouldn't have treated you like that. I didn't stop to think, to see who you really are. That wasn't fair to either of you." The twins exchanged a glance, their initial surprise giving way to a mixture of relief and satisfaction. They could sense the sincerity in his words, the honesty in the way he spoke. Janette took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. "We appreciate the apology. But please remember, we're just kids. We deserve the same respect as anyone else." Jane nodded, adding, "We're not asking for anything extra, just a chance to be seen for who we really are." Officer Mitchell nodded slowly, absorbing their words. He felt a pang of regret, an uncomfortable but necessary feeling that prompted him to take a hard look at himself. For years, he had gone about his duties without questioning his assumptions, without considering the perspectives of those on the other side of his authority. But today, two young girls had held up a mirror, forcing him to see himself in a new light. "I understand," he murmured, more to himself than to them. "And I promise you, I'll do better." People deserve to be treated with respect, no matter who they are or what they look like. The air between them was lighter now, a weight lifted. Officer Mitchell took a deep breath, then offered a small, tentative smile. "How about I take you back to the candy shop?" he asked, his tone warmer, almost fatherly. "I think it's time I get you two back where you belong." The twins smiled and nodded, feeling the tension dissolve as they settled back into their seats. The ride back was quiet but comfortable, a peaceful silence hanging in the air. Officer Mitchell's face reflected a mixture of thoughtfulness and determination, as though he were mentally revisiting the moments that had just passed, trying to make sense of how they had shifted something so deeply rooted within him. When they finally reached the candy shop, Officer Mitchell pulled over and looked back at the twins, a sense of gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You've taught me something important today. I won't forget it." Janette and Jane smiled, their eyes bright with the quiet pride of knowing they had made a difference, not just for themselves, but perhaps for others who might cross paths with Officer Mitchell in the future. They stepped out of the car and waved goodbye, watching as he drove off slowly, his posture visibly lighter, as though he were carrying less weight. As they walked home, Janette looked at her sister, a small smile playing on her lips. "I can't believe that happened," she whispered, still a little awestruck by the events of the day. Jane squeezed her hand, nodding. "Neither can I. But maybe Grandma was right. Maybe we do have a special strength inside us. It's not just about us. It's about helping others see the truth too." Together, they walked into the warm light of the setting sun, feeling the newfound sense of purpose and hope. They had faced injustice and come out stronger, realizing that their strength wasn't just for self-protection, but could inspire change in others. They had seen firsthand the power of compassion and courage, of standing up and speaking truth even when it was difficult. Thank you for watching. We hope this story touched your heart and sparked a new way of seeing things. Before you go, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next heartwarming tale. Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. We'd love to connect with viewers all around the world.